Tell me what your life was like before you died.
Well, I was living a very good life. I mean, I was a neurosurgeon. I'd followed in my father's footsteps in pursuing that field. I spent more than 15 years teaching at Harvard Medical School as an associate professor. I also taught at University of Virginia and University of Massachusetts, all in neurosurgery. So I was leading a very good life. I had a wife and two wonderful sons. And the day before I went to coma, I had no clue what was about to unfold in my life. But, I really have no complaints. I was, a conventional kind of reductive materialist neuroscientist. As much as I wanted to believe much of what I'd heard growing up in a Methodist church. And my father, although he was scientific, he was the head of a neurosurgical training program, he was also very spiritual and believed in the power of prayer, and he used that regularly in his work. But like so many of who grew up in the 60s and 70s, I was certain that science is the pathway to truth. And I made the mistake of thinking that an old, disproven Newtonian deterministic version of materialist science was a pathway to truth. And that is false. There's a much richer quantum-informed version of understanding consciousness. And I've spent the last 13 years since my coma working with other scientists around the world pursuing that. So it's an extraordinary gift. But yeah, the day before my coma, I had no inkling what was about to come across my bow. I think the best way to put it is I struggled a lot with my faith. The long career in neurosurgery left me really confused about how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. I really just couldn't see how that could happen. And of course, as I explained in my book, Proof of Heaven, which was the first book I wrote about all of this, I was sent into a dark night of the soul for 8 years before my coma. That has to do with the fact that I'm adopted. That's a huge part of the backstory and is very relevant to major discussions of my NDE and its aftermath and understanding. But turns out, as I describe in Proof of Heaven, in February of 2000, when I was, I had long ago, decades earlier, accepted that my birth mother was not looking for me. So I quit writing letters to the children's home. The most important thing to point out is there's one anomaly in my case that's atypical for NDEs, and that is that I was amnesic. I had no memory whatsoever for Eben Alexander's life. I had no words, no language, none of those religious preconceptions of Eben Alexander, none of the scientific knowledge of Eben Alexander. Everything was wiped clean. It was an empty slate. And it took me months to really understand why that would be. I mean, I came to realize, of course, NDEs are always tailored for the individual to help answer their deep and profound soul questions. And that's why I think mine took the role that it did, but it involved that necessity of the amnesia. But the journey itself in this amnesic state began in the earthworm's eye view, very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm that seemed to go on for ages. But I was rescued from that by a slowly spinning white light that came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And that ushered up like a wormhole into this brilliant, ultra-real Gateway Valley. Now, the Gateway Valley had many Earth-like features. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There was this lush, incredible kind of meadow surrounded by forest down below us, lush plant life, buds, blossoms, flowers, all of this very richly dynamic, alive, no sign of any death or decay. I remember thousands of beings down in this meadow, lots of joy and merriment and dancing and festivities, all being fueled because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating these chants, anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. Another crucial feature of that stage of the journey was that I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing with me, and those who've read Proof of Heaven will realize at the very end of the book, 4 months after awakening from coma, I actually discovered the identity of that beautiful woman. But at the time, I didn't know who she was, but her message to me, and it was delivered telepathically in this rich kind of emotional identity of communication. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are cared for. And I think that was kind of the ultimate message I was to bring back to this world, that and everything else about, being able to have this when my brain was documented to have such destruction that that brain could not have made any kind of dream or hallucination. And that's all confirmed in a case report on my medical records that came out 10 years after my coma by 3 physicians not involved in my care. That case report is in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, September 2018. But they make it very, very clear that my brain was far too damaged from all the data, neurologic data of my illness to have come up with anything. In terms of phenomenal experience, much less the most robust, meaningful, detailed, ultra-real experience I've ever been through in my life. Now, it turns out that was a stepping stone, as we say, Gateway Valley, to higher and higher levels. And I remember seeing all of 4-dimensional space-time collapsing down, then all of that spiritual realm, including a different causal ordering that I call deep time. Very important to understand. Earth time is only kind of a shared consensus time flow, but that ultimately in the spiritual realm, there's a more kind of fundamental marker of progression of soul growth and evolution of consciousness that occurs in deep time. But in the next phase of my journey, all of that collapsed down too. And through another wormhole that was engendered by the music of the angelic choirs, I ascended into the core realm. The core was infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with the divine healing love of that creator God source. I mean, that's what NDEers, prophets, and mystics have encountered for thousands of years across all belief systems in these journeys that show us there's more to the universe than just the physical world. And that's exactly what I bathed in. I mean, that beautiful ocean of love is something that any NDEer comes back and realizing there's nothing to fear about death. It's really kind of that returning to source and that beautiful oneness. But I was always told in the core, we'll teach you many things, but you'll be going back. You're not here to stay. And there came a time when that was true. And I tried to remember the musical notes, the melody, to conjure up that light portal that took me from the earthworm eye view up into the Gateway Valley, and it wouldn't happen. And that was towards the very end of the journey. That's when I saw thousands of beings going off into the distance, heads bowed, some holding candles, this murmuring energy coming from them. And the surprise of that was I was now back in this murkiest early realm, the earthworm eye view, and yet I still felt the incredible sense of love and connection and spiritual home of all those beings around me. In my writings, when I wrote it up weeks later, I said that was the power of prayer. That was what I was sensing from all those beings, and it was helping to guide me back to this world. There were 6 faces I saw at the very end, and they're important because they were veridical time anchors. There were people, family, and friends who were in the ICU room the last 24 hours of coma. And for all the elaborate reasons I go into detail in the book to explain it, but they showed me that the vast majority of the coma journey, which seemed to go on for months or years, I mean, an extraordinary journey, even though it happened in 7 Earth days of my time in coma. Finally, coming back to this world was the 6th face that I saw. It was a 10-year-old boy, and it turns out it was my son, Bond. I did not recognize him. My amnesia was still absolutely preponderant in this journey, but his pleading with me, he'd been outside the room where the doctors held the family meeting on day 7 of coma, where I had not been making any progress. They estimated 10% chance of survival early in the week, 2% at the end of the week, no chance of recovery, and that's why they recommended stopping the antibiotics. Bond overheard that conversation, came running down the hallway, realizing now it was much worse than what he'd been told, and he pulled open my eyelids, one eye looking over there, one down there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible picture. I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes, hear him with my ears, but his pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. I didn't understand the words, but the emotional engagement and the pleading is what got through. And that is what impelled me to come back to this world, even though I had no idea what I was coming back to. And every few weeks or month or so, I'll have a really deep dive in kind of consecutive meditations that will help me connect with that, not only to remember like some of the events of the NDE, but to develop this relationship. And I share a lot of that specifically in the book, Living in a Mindful Universe. especially around my adoptive father, because if I had scripted this whole thing, he had passed over 4 years before my coma. And if I had scripted it, he would have been there front and center. And yet he was not. But I did find him in a very beautiful way in deep meditation about two and a half years or so after my coma. And I explained that whole encounter in Living in a Mindful Universe, but it was an extraordinary experience that just shocked me no end. And yet it then made perfect sense. In essence, his sense of humor came through in a beautiful way. And he was telling me that he could not be a parent to me during my NDE, because then, if he'd been the guardian angel, I would have been more tempted to, in spite of a 1 in 10 million diagnosis of E. coli meningitis in an adult, in spite of a 1 in a billion recovery, if he had been there, I might have been more tempted to dismiss it all as you only see who you want to see on the way out. And that's why I actually had to have someone that I didn't know, who was very important to me in my life in a bigger sense. You know, going back to that birth family, having left the world 2 years before I even knew of her existence. And all of that was an important part of it. But I've used meditation to develop those kind of relationships. Now, you're exactly right, though, that ultra reality that to me was so shocking about the Gateway Valley and the core is something, for one thing, I found most NDEers describe that same kind of ultra reality, too real to be real kind of sense. And I had no idea of that because I'd never read the NDE literature before my coma. And my older son, who was majoring in neuroscience at the time, was smart enough to advise me to write down everything I could remember about my coma before I read anyone else's NDE account. And that was very good advice. And then I had a pristine kind of 20,000 word document explaining what I remembered and what I'd been through. And the golden rule, I would say, is essential to basically all major religious systems, and certainly some ethical atheist systems of morals and ethics. Golden rule is right there at the heart of it. And yet you see it perfectly demonstrated in life reviews, because if we hurt others, we are hurting ourselves. And that's what we discover in that life review. And that's a lesson that this world really needs to learn now, with all of our polarization and friction and false sense of separation that's inherent in the predominant materialist model. You know, that's what gives us that false sense of separation, where it's a quantum-informed version of reality and understanding consciousness fully allows for this oneness that we share, that we're in this together.